And with that, we will transition to our last of 4 panel discussions on which we will focus on 2 talks. The talks that we have just seen by Professor Vaithianathan and Professor Chun. And my colleague, Carl Larson, is joining us. So Carl, welcome back to the stage here, as it were.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I am trying to get sound. It's in, but I don't.
So,
there, no.
Yeah, and welcome back, panelists. Can I hear you today? Yes, I heard someone breathe, so I think the sound is good.
There
Excellent. Wonderful.
We can
wonderful.
hear you.
Excellent.
Okay.
So while we're waiting for Carl to get sound, though.
I'm good.
Okay. I was just going to say, Rhema, tell us what time it is right now.
Oh, I'm fine. It's 9:30 in the morning. Tomorrow morning for you guys. So.
Right. I know that some of these.
The future.
So it was this morning. I should have asked you that. Were you up at 3? Oh my goodness. Oh, thank you so much.
No.
It's a really that was really supererogatory of you. We really appreciate you going above and beyond in that way. So, Carl.
Hi. Hi, everyone. So good to be back with you and to be able to hear you from the start of the session, which is really kind of fun. I like that. We are going to do things just a touch differently this time because it's our last Q&A. So I want to give you a little heads up in advance. We're going to do the same format for about the first 40 minutes. And then the last 20, I'm going to give each of you a solo opportunity to tell us one takeaway that you've had during the week, that you've gotten from your panel colleagues. And then also I'd like you to indicate one question or challenge that you would like our audience to be thinking about after we wrap things up here. So I'll give you each about 2 to 3 minutes to talk once we get to about 20 minutes left in the Q&A. Does that sound good? Okay, great.
That's hard.
That's hard. All right. Our first question came in for Dr. I knew I was going to do that. Vaithianathan,
Call me
I
Rhema,
apologize.
Please. No,
okay,
please
Rhema.
call me Rhema. It's so much easier for everyone.
Agreed, with a question mark, agreed. The question is this. In your presentation, you talked about the impact and the results of metric scores of 1 compared to metric scores of 20, and how that worked, instinct and intuition kind of out of the equation. So it was relied upon the tool. How does that come into play with scores of 8 or 10 or 12 that are housed right in the middle? Are we at a place of necessity where some intuition and experience has to come into play then?
That is such a great question, because actually the bit that I didn't dwell on in that picture I showed you of black screening rates and white screening rates that I overlaid on each other after the score was seen, in the middle you still saw racial disparity. That is, when there was ambiguity, they broke on the side of that preconception, the model they had in their mind. So it was effective in helping them see risk in white children and see low risk in black children. And so when they saw white children with high scores, before they would have screened them out, now they screened them in. When they saw low risk in black children, they would have screened them in, now they screen them out. When they saw those in-between scores, you could kind of see them breaking towards their preconceptions of screening in more black children than white children. So I think that's there is some other research that colleagues have done. Alex Schuldechiva at CMU and her PhD student Amanda looked at some of our data, and where they could really see that there was an overriding of the score, and they were able to argue that that overriding was actually to improve the accuracy of the decision making. I won't go into details, but there is some sense that human intuition is doing a good job. But I think on the disparity side, there's some kind of evidence that human intuition might be just using preconceptions. So I think that's a really interesting area for us to look at.
Right. I agree. I would toss out to the panel as a whole then, what do we do with that? How do we address that particular challenge when we've chosen to move forward with a model, and we know that there are going to be spots within that model that might create challenges for non-biased decision making?
So personally,
Okay.
I don't think it's not a problem of the model, right? It's a problem of the people using the model, and the problem was worse before the model than it is now, right? In the sense that at least at the two extremes, you arguably have better decision making with the model than without. And maybe even in the middle, you have slightly better decision making, but it's harder to say. So, I mean, I think that's a larger question. That's not so much about the algorithm as it is about, helping people in a larger way to confront biases that are often implicit, but not always. And that's a much larger conversation in some ways than just a conversation about the algorithm. That's more about Wendy's fixing the world. And this is clearly one of the hardest things to fix, right?
Right. Talithia.
I think that we have to ask some of those hard questions. I mean, I'm thinking about when we do a search for a tenure track faculty member and we've got a pool of candidates and we're reading through applications. As a committee, we ask ourselves, well, we need to randomize how we read applications because many Asians are clustered at the end of the alphabet. And if you're just reading in order, by the time you get to most of your Asian applicants, you're tired, you're like, okay, yeah. And you're not giving them all of your energy. And so even that conversation around, we know that we bring biases to the table. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about this middle group. Maybe those decisions get made within a committee where we say, let's be conscious of not taking race into account. Because as soon as we bring it up, it's like, oh, we don't want to do that. Yeah, what do we need to do to address that? What do we need to do to be more inclusive and equitable? But when we don't address it, then our biases sort of creeps in and, we end up playing it out. And so I think by calling attention to it, by saying, hey, historically, we've tended to let our bias come out in this middle group. Let's make sure that when we look at this data now, we don't do that. Let's talk about, for each kid, how did we make that decision and make sure that we weren't subconsciously taking race into account. And so I think bringing it to the light instead of sort of letting people make those decisions in the dark is one way of addressing it.
Thank you. Anyone else care to comment? Okay. Well, let's move on to the next question. Several of you have talked about proxies. And how do we determine if a factor is functioning as a proxy that creates bias? Is it just a matter of proportionality? If you could offer some examples of what types of measures come back as valid and what come back as biased, and how we actually get to that point where we figure it out, that's kind of where we want to go with this particular question.
Can I just jump in there? So I feel like there's two issues of proxy. One is features. Those are the predictors. My main concern in child welfare is the training outcome. The outcome is a proxy. In almost all the work we do in homelessness and child protection, all the outcomes are truly proxies. We know that there is a lot more child maltreatment that goes on there than is reported. Some people estimate, 3, 5 times, 7 times as much child maltreatment as ever seen. We also know huge surveillance bias in our child welfare system. That is, a child who lives in poor areas with lots of oversight is more likely to be called in for something very benign, whereas egregious things happening in gated communities are not going reported. So there's two really problematic biases in the training outcome, and that surveillance bias drives a lot of the racial disproportionality that can come into our models. And so what we do in our work is we do what we call external validation, which is we go to ground truth outcomes that are not trained on, like hospitalization, death, and so on, and try to make sure that our models are calibrating against those ground truth outcomes. But those are also very, problematic, because even when we've looked at classifications of death, what is unknown reason for death, what is SIDS reason, those are all problematic classifications, because a mom who says my child died of maltreatment is going to take a lawyer and say, no, it's unknown, if they don't like that classification. So it's a hell of a thing.
Francesca.
Well, I just want to point out that this is also another example of why the different discipline tends to use the terminology in a slightly different way. And I wanted to give you just an example of what a proxy might mean. So a proxy could be a good predictor of the outcome, or a good predictor of any of the feature. A proxy could be a mediator, something that is between an effect of the feature and the outcome. A proxy could be an effect modifier that changes the relationship between the exposure, the feature, and the outcome. And we can bring many more examples. So I think what is really important thing here, and this is something we have been learning all together today, and that's my advice, is that in any type you're thinking about a model or an algorithm, whatever your question is, I think identify how you define every single element of this equation. It's really important, because different disciplines think about, define the different element of the model in slightly different ways.
Thank you.
Proxy,
Talithia.
Sorry. I was just going to say the proxy might mean a different thing depending what you're talking to.
Got it. Talithia, you had your hand up.
I was just going to add, because Francesca, what you said was so spot on, that proxies in and of themselves aren't evil or bad. It's proxy discrimination. It's when the proxy has a disparate impact on different groups of people, right? And so by disproportionately harming various members, that's part of what makes a proxy troublesome. So for example, a common one is zip code. Models or algorithms that use zip code, zip code is a proxy for race, because our communities are still very racially segregated. And so, right, you might have something that's dependent on zip code, and yet it's a direct proxy for race.
But I think that also works both ways, because when you look at, for example, when we try to understand whether what we're seeing is racial disparities, we put in poverty and other things and see if that can, explain it away, because the humans might be seeing poverty and we as modelers might be saying they're seeing race. So it's because we can't get in the head of what the human is really seeing. So it's quite, I think we sort of have to be quite responsible, isn't it, in how we deal with this.
Yes. Wendy.
Yeah, so historically, a proxy has been a stand-in, something that would vote on your behalf, right? And so there's an idea that a proxy is, there's a one-to-one relationship. It's not your agent. It doesn't take a cut. It's supposed to just stand in for you. And so trying to think through proxies and how they're used in data science is often like, can we find that substitute that won't take a cut, right? And I find that what's really important is to think through how we use proxies all the time in different contexts, and when are they controversial, when are they not. So for instance, I don't know if all of you remember Michael Mann's hockey stick. the hockey stick for global climate change. It was really controversial. It was used all the time as proof of global climate change. And then it was really, it was attacked. And it was attacked because they said they used proxies. And so they used proxies for climate change, such as ice rings. And not only that, what they did was, because there's so much tree ring data, if you only go by tree ring data, you're emphasizing a certain geographic area. So they used principal component analysis in order to weigh more equally things like things like ice core, right? So this became very controversial. They were using proxies. You can't use proxies. Each thing has to speak on its own. And a physicist, Mueller from Berkeley, actually got funded by the Koch brothers to take down this study for its bad use of proxies. And then he then showed that the hockey stick was worse than imagined. So the Koch brothers funded him to show that the situation was far worse, and that these proxies were actually, and the PCA was working properly in order to come up with the correct picture. So I think one thing that's so important is to think through a knee-jerk reaction against proxies, and also to think through, but really examine why we're willing to accept proxies in one situation, but not others. Why are we willing to believe models are true in one situation, but not others?
Francesca, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline Wendy's excellent point. And I think I want to add that often this terminology of proxy, which is something, for example, I've experienced myself in my work, gets manipulated by interest party, in this context, oil industry, to attack work based simply on saying they're not using real data, they're using a proxy, and therefore these research should be discarded. And so that really goes back to in a certain way, how the terminology, even when we're trying to use it in the best possible way, in an accurate way, gets manipulated to, by interest party. So it's a really tricky game what we're trying to do here.
Yes. Let's do one more, Pilar, and then we'll move on.
So, I always think also that, at least in the health data, proxies are really strongly correlated with something like race or gender. And it's part of the reason why you can't scrub the data, even if you wanted to, which I think we've heard good arguments for why that's often wouldn't be the right approach. But if you wanted to scrub the data of race or gender, you can't really do it, because if you want to look at health data, whether somebody's had hormone replacement therapy over age 55 is a pretty good proxy. I don't know that there's any situation in which people who are identified as male would be getting that kind of hormone replacement therapy, right? If somebody's had certain, tests or treatments, pretty much only people with biology we identify as male are going to have those tests or treatments. So there are those things that we can clearly and explicitly identify as proxies for, say, gender, right? But one of the things that happens is that there may be other things in there that we don't know that they're so highly correlated with race or gender or class. And so we actually have to study our data and the way our algorithms work and are trained on them. And I think Wendy said something really important earlier, which is that we can use these outcomes to help us understand the way the healthcare system is working, the way society is patterned by inequalities, right? And we have to do that with our healthcare data, because we don't always understand what is functioning as a proxy and what is not.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the other things that's different about this Q&A is that my colleagues didn't want me to hog the last session to myself. So they're both actually sitting here with me, and Lisa has a question for the panel.
So Yeah, so first of all, I'm thinking about the fact that there's a way in which we assume that race is not a proxy for itself, right? Like as if we could draw a bright line around the things that would actually identify race and that would be a constant over time. And I think even Pilar's observations about the way census data has changed would suggest the limitations of that. But I wanted to ask a question specifically to Wendy, and that comes right from what Pilar was just saying just now, and that is, you've suggested that we should rethink the ways in which we use models and to use them almost as diagnostic tools rather than predictive models for the future or predictive tools that enable us to make decisions. What would this look like in a specific context? Can you give some examples? Or maybe would it mean stopping using them in the kinds of ways that Rhema is talking about, for instance? Or is there a way to dance on both feet at the same time? I mean, I guess you usually dance on both feet, but you know what I mean. To do both things at the same time.
Well, I think why Rhema's presentation was so important was emphasizing that what matters is that contact between the agent and the person, right? So it doesn't matter what the model is doing, that's that moment of contact that's so important, and trying to think through our idealized vision of what it would look like if these things weren't in place. And I'm thinking through here of these, again, as diagnostic models. The example with Amazon and its hiring program is great. I mean, there's, so there it shows clearly if there's woman on your CV, you lost a point. Now, there could be, they always say it's learning on secondary features, et cetera, right? As if humans don't as well train on secondary features. So I think that these are moments to learn. And if you talk to a lot of people who are building these models, they're really thoughtful and they can see where things are going askew. And so talking and thinking through these, when they come up with results which are so against what was intended, is important because it also takes the weight off individual intention. So it's not like this person, like the idea behind Compass was somehow you get rid of individual bias and then you get rid of racism, right? And it actually showed us from the pursuant of racism that it's not, it's simply an issue of individual bias. And so if it is systemic, what can we think about and understand from these models themselves? And I think this sort of diagnostic and probing work is often used in science and engineering as well to understand a problem, a materials solution. It's very much, a lot of machine learning is used that way. So it's not a dramatically new or different use of machine learning, but it's one that focuses on this understanding the historical patterns, given the limited understanding of the past, present, and future that's part of these models.
Others want to speak to that?
Rhema had her hand up.
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Wendy a question, which is, how do we, if we kind of think of algorithms as mirrors of our past, and in my case, how do we reflect that back to my frontline workers who have been trying to do a damn good job in a way that doesn't alienate them and make them feel like I'm telling them their decision making is biased?
Yeah, I think when Talithia was talking about what was happening with the hiring committee, it was really, the way she phrased it was as we have these issues. So it's not saying, okay, you do, it's we know that this happens. So that's certainly one way. But I think, what's so fascinating to me about a lot of the analysis of machine learning and discrimination is that a lot of people who didn't necessarily engage with questions of discrimination before are really concerned about it now. Yeah. So this is an opportunity, and it's because these programs have made clear certain results. And it's not the fault of the program, but rather, again, a way to see things. And it's mirrored by a program doing this, not you, right? And so I think having that kind of dialogue and seeing it from that different mirror is actually a way for people to come together. And I've been really heartened by the ways in which people in civil rights and civil liberties have been coming together around these questions.
Oh, Cynthia, please.
So I just wanted to add something to what Wendy said. Back to my usual interpretability pedestal here, which is that, it's really hard to determine bias without transparency, without interpretability. So, if you say to people, well, we're biased against so-and-so, but we can't really figure out why. That's not really going to help them fix the problem. It's like, well, we're biased against these people because, we seem to be biased because we seem to be having more poor children who are in this program rather than children who actually need to be in the program. It's like, okay, now we have to be more careful when we're investigating a child of this type. So, and then with Compass, again, the problem, I believe, is one of really transparency, because since nobody knows what's in it, you can't really argue about the factors that are in it and whether they should be used. And I think if we made the models transparent and public, then we could make that argument a little bit better.
I would like to ask, I think maybe a follow-up question, Wendy, which is, how do we interrogate default assumptions? That is, one of the profound things about what you're saying is really the very foundational concepts upon which we even thought up something like networks. And obviously we don't start over, as Plato suggested, by, putting babies on an island and teaching them, right? We start in the middle of things. We start with where we are, and we're out in the ocean in Neurath's boat, and we're rebuilding it. So how do we actually interrogate the tools that we cannot but continue to use while we are doing it?
I think that one thing that's really key is to try to think of the ways in which technology, the social sciences, and humanities are always intertwined. So often people say, well, if we just had social sciences or humanities, we'd have ethical tech. And I think when we think through homophily, the fact that homophily came from the social sciences really puts a scupper on that. And the issue isn't that we need to add social sciences. The social sciences is in there, but it's often not the best social science. And by that I mean that, if you think of homophily, it does explain certain forms of connection. But even within their own study, even the point that they were trying to make is that this is just one small part of friendship formation. And that the projects in real life is filled with all these other connections. But if you live in a world in which only one type of connection is possible, where you can't have those other connections, then things become really skewed. So I think that one thing that's absolutely important is we engage people's disciplines, we read textbooks, we think through things together, we have these conversations, and we challenge each other's first principles in the nicest possible ways, because it's at the level of the first principle that often these assumptions like homophily that are made. And we've seen the detrimental impact of homophily.
I have to, please, yes, Pilar.
So actually just going right off of the last part of what Wendy said, I think in working in interdisciplinary teams, you're more likely to get people saying, but wait, I don't really quite get that, right? And so then in the process of trying to explain like how this model was constructed in detail, then that's where you start to be able to interrogate some assumptions there and some expectations. The second thing I would say is that Cynthia's point about transparency, I think if you can't get into a model and the training data to understand what assumptions are built into it, it's going to be a lot harder to make this kind of progress, right? So I think that transparency piece of this is also really key.
Cynthia.
I'm gonna add to that a little bit more. I forgot to say that one thing I pointed out about Compass that people didn't seem to pick up on is the fact that typos seem to be influencing the Compass results fairly often. And, or at least, I don't know if it's typos, but it's like some data problem that and basically these data problems influence everybody who's subjected to the whole system. So there's some unfairness that just simply comes from weirdness in the data.
Typing.
And, so it's like a bias, but it's like a noise bias. It's like, if you end up in this system, you're subject to this noise. Like you might go to prison for no reason. Like who knows? And then you think about, okay, well, who are the people subjected to this system? And you're like, well, that's biased. So I mean, it can be very complicated how these weird forms of bias end up in the system.
Well, and I mean, in our carceral and penal system, the idea of a sentencing or that kind of decision being arbitrary and capricious is viewed as almost the definition of unfairness within that kind of system, right?
Rhema.
So are you saying, I guess, Pilar, that it doesn't happen in human-only systems? Because I can tell you in child welfare, there's a very recent case of a child death where a removal order was in place, a supervisor overrode it, and at the end, when it was investigated, the supervisor who overrode the removal order had not read the child's file. And the child died. And I have to tell you, having worked in child welfare now for years, this is not unusual. People don't have the time to get to grips with. So are you telling me that in human systems, there aren't typos,
not at all.
there aren't
I mean,
misreads, and there aren't capricious decision-making?
No, absolutely. I mean, this notion that arbitrary capricious is actually a term of art in law, and that term of art evolved long before we were using machine learning in the system, right? So I am in no way saying that this is only applied to machine learning, but I think the point is that it also applies to machine learning. So people who think that machine learning is so much more sort of clean and removed from this human set of issues because it's all about math are mistaken.
I'm going to, go ahead, Rhema, and then we'll pitch it back to Carl.
So this is too much of a conversation between me and Pilar, but I feel that this tendency for us to try to drag down these sorts of machine learning tools, which I completely agree with you, is because they're not the panacea that some people in Silicon Valley claim them to be, has actually backfired. I mean, last week, ACLU has written a piece on our work, and we gave them all our data, we gave them all our code, enabling them to write. They didn't look at any of it as far as I can make out, but enabled them to write a piece that frankly said we're better to use, 20-year-old pieces of paper which have no validation to machine learning tools. So I kind of felt, because they didn't get to grips with what was being done today. And so I just think we have to continuously drag people back to what is happening today, right now, on your streets, to the most vulnerable people in your neighborhoods. Ask who is making decisions about the houses they can live in, the money they can have, the children they can have in their house. Ask them how those decisions are being made before you start attacking these tools.
I would agree with you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Carl.
All right.
Carl.
I have one more question. I think we can banter around a little bit before we move to your individual final comments. It's been a theme both days in every Q&A and in almost every presentation that community involvement is one of the keys to preventing bias, right? Having the community involved in multiple aspects, having multidisciplinary teams. I'm wondering, one of the questions that's come in is that at what level does that community participation really happen? Are we talking about representatives of populations, or are we talking grassroots, get in the neighborhood, talk to people from house to house? And is that enough to really address the issues of bias that we're talking about? Wendy.
I'll start us. I think that we have to stop asking if one thing is enough, because it's clearly that one thing can't be enough. I think this has been clear over the next over the couple of days. So I think the question I would differently frame it is, could it be part of the arsenal, and what can it do? And here again, I would point to the role, the work that Julia Dalla Riva in Christchurch, New Zealand, is doing. With a data center that's not only community-led, but soon to be community-owned. And it's about urban data. And so it's one of the first to do so. And the reason why it came about was in part because they were supposed to put a data center together, and the community were like, you're studying us. Why? How can we work on this? And I think it's just one part of a larger question of community involvement.
Thank you. Anyone else? Francesca.
So, well, first of all, I think how much of community engagement and at which level highly depends on the question, right? And what we are trying to do with this machine learning algorithm. I do think that, and I completely agree with Wendy. I mean, there are so many different elements that we need to consider. In my own world, and thinking about health impact of contaminants or health impact of climate change, I think that the most important step where we wanted to engage community is when we are deciding which data to use and where the data are coming from, and how accurate or inaccurate or biased this data might be. And so, so that's one element. And the second step in the work pipeline, where I think community engagement is really important, is when we, before releasing the results in a way that impact policymaking, and discussing with the community what we found and the degree to which they feel adequately represented and that we have adequately accounted for the complexity of what they are experiencing. So, for example, if we are trying to assess whether or not fine particulate matter or pollution affect their health, and we are reporting that these effects are much worse in some parts or in some communities, we need to go and explain this to the community, because they are bringing back additional information like, well, but if you consider the fact that also our water is polluted, that also we have higher level of allergens inside the house, that we don't have access to parks or healthy food, right? So I think that that's really helped us in two ways. One is to making sure that we are not misattributing the cause of the disease to the food, though, is when we report the result, we say, well, you should only pay attention to particulate matter because you can, clean the hair, and that's important, but you're not going to solve the tremendous health burden unless you cut in half the risk of cardiovascular disease and the fact that they don't have access to clean water as well. So I think it really depends. But my context is at the beginning and at the end.
Okay, thank you.
I think
Talithia.
Talithia.
Yes, Wendy, I love your reframing of the question, because I think you're so right. We have to attack the problem at different stages. One way that I've attacked it is, of course, working with local girls and girls of color in the community. And part of that came from when I got to Harvey Mudd, not seeing these women reflected in my classroom, not seeing them at our institution, not seeing them at the Claremont colleges, and yet we're in Southern California. Like, they're all around us, and yet they're not in this place. And so, part of saying, well, let me bring junior high and high school girls to campus and let them experience being in this space and see themselves as a part of it was sort of one factor. Exposing them to STEM and, exciting other women was another. But the part that I didn't I didn't make this connection until the parents got there, was that we had to take time to educate parents on what it means to support their daughters who want to study STEM. And it came down to things that were very simple. When your daughter comes home and says, I don't know how to do this math problem, can you help me? Don't respond with, well, I don't know how to do it either, and I never needed it, and you don't need it, And parents will be like, that's not what I'm supposed to say. I'm like, that's not what you're supposed to say, And so, your parents are taking notes of like, here's how you support, here's how you encourage. When she comes home and says, I want to drop chemistry, you say, no, you can do this, and let me find ways to help you. And so coaching parents on how to best support, because ultimately it's the home environment that is going to shape the direction that, that increases this representation in STEM. One day at Harvey Mudd with Talithia, it's nice, but it's not going to be transformational as much as knowing that your parents support you and are going to encourage you and push you to stay in this very challenging area, and that you have that support at home.
Pilar, you had a statement.
Yeah. So I think it's not community engagement, but there are a variety of communities, and of course it depends on what kind of machine learning you're developing and for what purpose. But so in medical machine learning, like, patients are really key, right? To understanding the nature of a disease that you are studying or trying to ameliorate or trying to learn something about, right? So are the relevant providers, in the sense that if they're going to be the users of the algorithm, then you need to understand how they are thinking about what they're doing, how this is going to fit into their workflow or not, right? So I think that's just an example of two different kinds of communities, but I think there are lots of different kinds of communities that need to be engaged and need to be engaged at various stages in the process.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we've reached that time of the final Q&A. So I'm going to randomly call on you, and I know every one of you, when I said that, reacted just like our students who went, not me first, not me first. But someone has to be first. So you've got about 2 minutes to tell us one takeaway that you've learned from listening to everyone else over the last 2 days, and one question or challenge that you want to leave our viewers and listeners with before we wrap things up. And the lucky draw is, Wendy, would you go first, please?
Sure, happily. So I think that what I've learned is how to think across difference. Because you could have put 6 of us together in a different way, and we could have had a very different conversation than we did. And I think what was really key about this format was being able to think with each other and think through the limitations of our own approaches in conversation with you all. So I thought that this was really productive because if you read our papers initially, you would have thought that many of us were in different positions, and we were able to talk through things and understand things in a way that I personally greatly appreciated. And so what I would throw out is along these lines, which is it's so easy to point out flaws. It's so easy to say, well, this model was wrong, or that because this wasn't true, we didn't stop it before all the susceptibles were infected, not thinking of the R naught number or, right. A lot of other things. How can we use these and the flaws of them in order to imagine a better future? Rather than thinking that we have to think this model is right or wrong, but maybe parts of it gets right and part of it gets wrong is exactly what we need in order to intervene and change the world.
Thank you very much. Cynthia, please.
Awesome. Okay, I'm writing frantically on my napkin over here. Okay, so I want to, and I want to end on kind of a hopeful note, right? So I learned from Francesca's talk that the government is actually reducing air pollution levels over the whole U.S., and that makes me really happy. That that gives us hope that these analytical models, like the data, is actually influencing even what we breathe, and that influences our health. So this is a major thing. From Rhema, I learned that it's possible to use resources better by allocating services to those who need them, and not just someone who sort of thought a child might need it, but maybe they didn't. And then from Talithia, I learned that we can do better with education, right? And I'm glad that she's doing that, and I'm glad that other people are doing that as well. And then from Pilar and Wendy, I learned that knowing that the ways that bias ends up in the data helps us do a better job in decision making. And so the question I want to leave to the audience is, how do we create better human AI centaurs? Like, how do you kind of blend better the human and the AI? Like, how do we get people to understand what the AI is doing and respond to it better? And how can we make AI less biased than the usual human decision making?
Thank you very much. Rhema?
Oh, wow. So I loved how we were all coming at it from different points of view. What I took away is that we were all sort of trying to hold a mirror back to society about what was happening. And what I took away from Michael's is that our mirror might be accurate, but the people who are holding the mirror might not be trusted. So people who are looking at the mirror don't trust that they're not looking into something we've manipulated. So that made me think, how do I become more trustworthy, and how do I become more trusted? So there are two bits to that, right? How can I be more authentic? And sometimes I've now been thinking maybe some of my community engagement is community engagement as theater rather than community engagement in an authentic way. And that's a struggle I really have and I hold with myself. And so I've really started thinking, what do I have to do differently to become more trustworthy? And what do I have to do to become more trusted, which is maybe the people who are holding the mirror, the diversity, like Talithia was saying, of the people holding the mirror, maybe the people whose lives we represent as well, maybe what was traditionally called the flyover country. Maybe we're not describing the lives of people well enough and diversely enough. So that's a long ramble to say I'm taking a lot away, and most of what I'm taking away is something about what I do and how can I be more authentic and trustworthy.
Thank you very much. Francesca?
So I was doing the same. So I think one thing for sure is I would have been so, considering the lively conversation that we had, I think that if we will continue this conversation among the six of us, I can see us building a center of human-centered machine learning that is unbiased and you can trust, and it's going to solve all the problems in the world. So that's really my dream moving forward. So,
I love it.
So this has been a great experience. Now, on a more serious thought, a couple of thoughts that I've learned from my wonderful colleagues. So first of all, I think big data could lead to big confusion and big harm if we don't spend time, intellect, responsibility in understanding where the data are coming from, where is the context of the data, and the degree to which this data can be affected by bias. And so I think that's something that was applicable, I think, across everything that we have said. And so I think that a very important question that was raised throughout some of the previous panel is really going back to how do we regulate data governance so that there is a right incentives for everyone to share these really rich sources of data in a way that we can really do what I really like now, the word authentic and responsible AI and machine learning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pilar?
Oh, wow. So I guess, first of all, I just want to point out that as the organizers, you guys did such a great job of, for instance, giving us some examples, I think, in Rhema and Francesca, of really, to me, very hopeful and positive implementations of machine learning. And also to people who are doing, I think, really working at this with the utmost commitment to being responsible and thoughtful about what they're doing. So, it certainly makes me hopeful and really happy to hear them talk about their projects. And at the same time, I think those of us who have raised real criticisms, I think one of the things I heard from my colleagues on the panel is to kind of remember really clearly in making your criticisms that this is a human endeavor. And as much as we talk about machine learning, humans are all over this at every single part of it. And so in what way, we can't actually buy into this kind of framing of machine learning as something separate from the humans who are doing it. And when we're making our critiques, we can't do our critiques in a way that buy into that framing of machine learning. We have to keep our critiques grounded in the understanding that this is all about humans, right? In its construction and implementation. So I think that's part of what I take away.
Thank you very much. And Talithia.
I had a couple of things that stood out. First, Francesca, when you talked about pollution and how even if we're within the limits, we can still cause harm and end up killing people. That was really a shocker to me because I felt like, but the limits are there to save lives. And so that was such an eye-opening aha moment. And then Wendy, you reframing, proxy for race as proxy for racism just was like a light going off. It was I remember the moment it made me feel like when I started reframing slaves as enslaved people, right? Instead of them being a slave, this is something that happened to you. You were enslaved. That reframing of that thought of proxy for racism and proxy for sexism made me much more acutely aware of it. You're right. It's not just a proxy for race. It's a proxy for what's been built into the data. And so I think in terms of sort of my hopeful high visioning, what's come out is that we really need a federal machine learning algorithm task force that has to really, maybe this is what our group is going to become, Francesca, this is what, our center is going to get funded.
I see the first 6 members right there.
Do you see it? We're the founders, the founding mothers of, I use mothers loosely, but yes. But similar to the FDA, there was sort of trepidation about the vaccine. And then it was like, oh, it got the FDA stamp of approval. Okay, shoot me in the arm, and I think I want to feel that way about machine learning algorithms that affect the public. I want to know that there's a stamp of approval that has come from a group who has looked at all of these issues and said, yes, this algorithm passes muster, and yes, you can use it on the public. I feel like we don't have that. And so individuals end up, when it becomes public, we try to figure out what's working behind the black box, but often we don't know that. And it's making decisions that affect society in sometimes detrimental ways. And so that's my key takeaway.
Wow. I know that each of us wants to say something a little quick here before we let you all go. I just want you to know I had a ball the last 2 days. I thought the conversation was spectacular, and it was this remarkable balance of challenge and support. And wow, do we need more of that in the world? So it was it was really exciting to see the lectures and to hear the dialogue and to get to be a part of it was just a blast to me. So very thankful for your time and your effort and your energy and everything you put into the last 2 days. Thank you very much. Tom?
Thank you.
So thank you so much. So a couple of years ago, when I envisioned this conference as an applied mathematician who kind of dabbles in a little bit of programming and statistics, I thought, Wouldn't it be really cool to have a conference that focused on machine learning, big data, and highlighted some of the really neat applications that are out there? But I think this conference morphed, because of you all, into something much more special and much deeper than what my original vision was. I wanted to highlight this neat application and that neat application, but this really became, I don't know, something more about social justice and highlighting how all of us are affected by that and how all of us can contribute to make a better world. And I just want to thank you for kind of opening my eyes to a lot of these things when I was thinking about it as a nerdy mathematician that I am, right? This was eye-opening and wonderful.
Well, and what I can say is that I have an extremely high water table. It's like right here. And so I'm having a hard time not just getting weepy right now. Right now, I would like nothing more than to adjourn to the watering hole of our choice, to celebrate with a beverage of our choice, and continue this conversation, which has been so rich. The welcome mat is always out for you at Gustavus, and there's a corner of my office that would be perfect for the center. So just let me know if I'll start making this stationary. But in all seriousness,
the only way that's going to work is if we rotate each one of them coming to campus, and then we each get to see them all. That's the only way that's going to work.
You're absolutely. I'm watching the camera people trying to snap back and forth between us. Maybe they'll just pan it back. But also the degree to which you've made the argument for interdisciplinary work. I was scrolling through the questions that didn't get asked, and my philosophy friend and colleague friend and colleague Corinne asked, how do humanists acquire the technical expertise needed for us to be useful parts of this conversation? And that, I think, is one of the things you've really invited us to think about, is how do we get involved in building these things that are better, because all of us are coming up against the limits of our knowledge and saying, I know this needs to be solved, but I don't know what it looks like. And finally, you all are my training data set for when I train my algorithm for identifying smart beings who explain challenging ideas in comprehensible ways. This is the training data set right there, you 6.
Thank you.
We don't need anybody else. So thank you so much. Seriously, we hope to welcome you whenever you can make it to St. Peter. We'd love to have you. Thanks so much. This has been an incredible experience.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
And thank you for bringing us all together.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our pleasure.
You're welcome. It was our pleasure.